My name is Robert Henderson, and for 23 years I stood behind the podium at Kingdom Hall, speaking words that I believed came straight from God Himself. I was an elder, a respected man in our congregation in Cedar Falls, a small town where everyone knew everyone, and where being one of Jehovah's Witnesses meant something. I preached about the sanctity of blood, about how accepting a transfusion was worse than murder in God's eyes, about how we must be willing to die rather than defile ourselves with this forbidden substance. I believed every single word with the fervor of a man who thought he held divine truth in his hands. My wife Margaret and I raised our 3 children in this faith, teaching them that loyalty to the organization meant loyalty to God, that questioning the elders meant questioning the Almighty Himself. We were the model family, the ones other families looked up to, the ones who never missed a meeting, never questioned a teaching, never wavered in our dedication. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for that autumn day in 2019 when everything I believed, everything I had preached, everything I had built my life upon came crashing down like a house of cards in a hurricane. It was a Tuesday afternoon, one of those crisp October days when the leaves in Cedar Falls painted the streets in shades of gold and crimson. I was in my study, preparing for Thursday's meeting, reviewing the Watchtower article about remaining faithful in trials, when the phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Sarah Mitchell from Cedar Falls General Hospital, and her words hit me like a freight train at full speed. "Mr. Henderson, your son David has been in a serious car accident. You need to come immediately. He's lost a significant amount of blood, and his condition is critical." The world around me seemed to freeze in that moment, the familiar walls of my study suddenly feeling like they were closing in. David, my 25-year-old son, my firstborn, the boy who used to sit beside me during meetings and ask innocent questions about Bible stories, was fighting for his life just 15 minutes away from our home. Margaret and I rushed to the hospital, our hearts pounding with a terror that no parent should ever have to experience. The drive felt both eternal and instantaneous, time warping in that strange way it does when crisis strikes. I found myself praying frantically, begging Jehovah to spare my son's life, promising to be even more faithful, even more dedicated to the organization, if only David would survive. The hospital corridors smelled of antiseptic and despair, nurses hurrying past us with urgent purpose, while we followed a young resident to the intensive care unit. When I saw David lying there, pale as the white sheets that covered him, connected to machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical persistence, something inside my chest cracked like old leather. His breathing was shallow, his face drawn, and for a moment I couldn't reconcile this fragile figure with the vibrant young man who had been renovating his first apartment just that morning. Dr. Mitchell, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and steady hands, pulled Margaret and me aside into a small consultation room that felt more like a confession booth. Her words were measured but urgent, delivered with the precision of someone who had given similar news to countless families before us. "Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, David has suffered massive internal bleeding from the impact. We've done everything we can surgically, but his blood count has dropped to dangerously low levels. Without an immediate blood transfusion, he won't survive the next few hours. We need your consent to proceed with the transfusion right away." The silence that followed her words was deafening, broken only by Margaret's sharp intake of breath, and the distant sounds of hospital life continuing around us. In that moment, 23 years of indoctrination crashed headlong into the most basic human instinct, a father's love for his son. I felt my mouth go dry as the implications of Dr. Mitchell's words sank in. This wasn't a theoretical discussion. During a Thursday night meeting about hypothetical scenarios and abstract principles. This was my son, my flesh and blood, dying before my eyes, and the very doctrine I had preached countless times was now standing between him and life itself. Margaret grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my flesh with desperate intensity. "Robert, what do we do? What do we do?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of every parent's worst nightmare. I looked into her eyes and saw my own terror reflected back at me, mixed with a pleading that went beyond words. She was asking me to save our son, but we both knew what that meant, according to everything we had been taught, everything we had built our lives around. The next few minutes passed in a blur of internal warfare. Dr. Mitchell excused herself to check on David, giving us a moment to process what she had told us. Margaret and I stood there in that sterile little room, holding each other and trembling like leaves in a storm. I could hear my own voice from countless Thursday nights echoing in my head, stern and certain, explaining to the congregation how blood transfusions were forbidden by Scripture, how we must trust in Jehovah's will even unto death, how martyrdom for our faith was the highest honor we could achieve. I remembered the stories I had told about faithful brothers and sisters who had chosen death over blood, how I had praised their courage and held them up as examples for all of us to follow. But now, faced with the reality of watching my own son slip away, those noble words felt like ashes in my mouth. I thought about calling the hospital liaison committee, those elders specially trained to handle medical situations involving blood transfusions. I knew they would come immediately, armed with alternative treatment pamphlets and legal documents, ready to help us navigate this crisis while maintaining our faith. But something held me back. Some instinct that whispered this decision was too personal, too immediate, too sacred to be influenced by committee procedures and organizational protocols. This was about David, about my son, about the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle and helped with homework and watched grow into a fine young man. This wasn't about doctrine or loyalty or organizational reputation. This was about life and death, pure and simple. Margaret pulled away from me slightly and looked directly into my eyes with an intensity I had rarely seen from her. "Robert, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen with your heart, not your head." Her voice was steady now, filled with a maternal strength that I recognized but had never fully appreciated until that moment. "I've been having doubts for months, maybe years. Not about God, but about the organization. About whether everything we've been taught is really from Him or from men who claim to speak for Him. I see how they treat people who ask questions, how they silence anyone who disagrees, how they put their rules above people's lives. And now they want us to let our son die for one of those rules." Her words hit me like a physical blow because they gave voice to thoughts I had been pushing down for longer than I cared to admit. There had been moments over the years when I had questioned certain teachings, when I had seen good people disfellowshipped for minor infractions while corrupt elders were protected, when I had watched families torn apart by shunning policies that seemed more cruel than loving. But I had always pushed those doubts aside, telling myself that my limited human understanding couldn't grasp God's perfect wisdom as channeled through His organization. Now, standing in that hospital room with my son's life hanging in the balance, those carefully suppressed questions came flooding back with unstoppable force. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside pulled me from my spiraling thoughts, and I knew without looking that our ordeal was about to become even more complicated. Brother Timothy Walsh and Brother James Crawford appeared in the doorway of the consultation room, their black briefcases in hand and their faces wearing that practiced expression of somber concern that I had seen them use countless times before. Timothy, the presiding overseer of our congregation, was a man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of authoritative presence that commanded respect in any room. James, younger but equally committed to organizational protocol, served as our hospital liaison coordinator and had handled dozens of similar cases over the years. They had driven over as soon as they received word about David's accident, ready to provide spiritual support and ensure that our family remained faithful to Jehovah's standards during this trial. "Brother Henderson, Sister Henderson," Timothy said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of pastoral authority mixed with genuine concern. "We came as soon as we heard about David. How is he doing?" I found myself automatically straightening up, falling back into the ingrained patterns of deference that 23 years of organizational training had drilled into me. "The doctors say he needs a blood transfusion to survive," I replied, the words feeling foreign and dangerous coming out of my mouth. "They say without it, he won't make it through the next few hours." Timothy and James exchanged a quick glance, the kind of wordless communication that happens between men who have worked together in crisis situations many times before. I saw something flicker across Timothy's face, a momentary tightening around his eyes that suggested this conversation was going to be more challenging than he had anticipated. "Brother Henderson," James said, opening his briefcase and pulling out a familiar folder filled with medical documents and legal forms. "You know that we have alternatives to blood transfusion that are acceptable to Jehovah. We have relationships with doctors who specialize in bloodless surgery and treatment. Let me speak with Dr. Mitchell about what options might be available for David." His words were measured and professional, delivered with the confidence of a man who had navigated these waters before. But I noticed something in his tone that I had never picked up on during all those years of working alongside him. There was a script-like quality to his speech, as if he was reciting lines he had memorized, rather than speaking from genuine concern for my son's welfare. Margaret stepped forward, her face flushed with an emotion I had rarely seen from her in all our years of marriage. "What if there are no alternatives? What if blood is the only thing that can save him?" Her question hung in the air like a challenge, and I saw both Timothy and James stiffen slightly. They were not accustomed to being questioned, especially not by a sister, and especially not in a situation where their authority was being directly challenged. Timothy cleared his throat and adopted the patient but firm tone he used when correcting wayward congregation members. "Sister Henderson, we must trust in Jehovah's wisdom. If he allows David to die rather than accept blood, then that is his will, and we must accept it with faith. Many of our brothers and sisters have faced this same test, and those who remain faithful have been blessed with the hope of resurrection." The casualness with which Timothy spoke about David's potential death struck me like a slap across the face. This wasn't some abstract theological discussion during a circuit assembly. This was my son, fighting for his life just a few rooms away, and these men were talking about his death as if it were simply another opportunity to demonstrate organizational loyalty. I felt a surge of anger rise in my chest, hot and unfamiliar, directed at men I had considered my spiritual brothers for over 2 decades. "Timothy," I said, my voice sharper than I had ever used with him before, "you're talking about my son's life. You're talking about watching a 25-year-old man die because of a rule that most Christians don't even follow." The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically with my words. James closed his briefcase with a sharp snap and gave me a look that I had seen him use with disfellowshipped individuals who dared to question organizational decisions. "Brother Henderson, I'm surprised to hear you speaking this way. You've been an elder for over 20 years. You know that this isn't just a rule, it's a biblical command. Acts chapter 15 clearly states that we must abstain from blood. Are you suggesting that we ignore God's direct commandment?" His words carried an implicit threat, a reminder that questioning organizational doctrine was a serious offense that could result in judicial action. I had seen good men stripped of their privileges and eventually disfellowshipped for expressing doubts about far less central teachings than the blood doctrine. Margaret moved closer to me, and I felt her hand slip into mine, offering silent support for whatever I was about to say. In that moment, I realized that she was prepared to face whatever consequences came from challenging these men, prepared to risk everything we had built within the organization if it meant saving our son's life. Her courage gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. James, I've studied Acts 15 many times. It was written to address a specific situation involving meat sacrificed to idols and dietary restrictions for new Gentile converts. The early Christians were concerned about maintaining unity between Jewish and Gentile believers. There's significant scholarly debate about whether those verses even apply to medical blood transfusions, which didn't exist when the Bible was written. Timothy's face darkened at my words, and I could see the wheels turning in his mind as he processed the implications of an elder openly questioning fundamental organizational doctrine. "Robert," he said, using my first name in a way that immediately established distance between us, "you're engaging in independent thinking that could lead you down a very dangerous path. The faithful and discreet slave has provided clear guidance on this matter through decades of careful biblical research. Are you suggesting that your personal interpretation of Scripture is superior to the understanding provided by God's organization?" The phrase, "faithful and discreet slave," referred to the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses, the small group of men in New York who claimed to be God's sole channel of communication with humanity in these last days. Before I could respond, Dr. Mitchell appeared in the doorway, her expression grave and urgent. "Mr. Henderson, I'm sorry to interrupt, but David's condition has deteriorated significantly in the last 30 minutes. His blood pressure is dropping rapidly, and his organs are beginning to shut down. We have perhaps an hour, maybe less, before we lose him entirely. I need your decision about the transfusion immediately, or we won't be able to help him." Her words cut through the theological debate like a knife through paper, bringing us back to the stark reality of the situation. This wasn't a classroom discussion about biblical interpretation. This was a race against time to save my son's life, and every minute we spent debating doctrine was a minute closer to losing him forever. Timothy stepped forward, his voice taking on the commanding tone he used during judicial committee meetings. "Doctor, thank you for the update, but Brother Henderson and his family need time to consider their options in light of their religious convictions. Perhaps you could explain what bloodless alternatives might be available." Dr. Mitchell looked confused and frustrated, clearly not understanding why we would want to delay life-saving treatment to explore alternatives that she had already determined would be insufficient. "Sir, I appreciate your religious concerns, but I need to be clear with you. There are no bloodless alternatives that will be effective in David's current condition. He has lost too much blood, and his body cannot recover without immediate transfusion. Any delay at this point will result in his death." The finality in Dr. Mitchell's voice seemed to settle over the room like a heavy blanket. Margaret began to cry softly, the sound breaking my heart in ways I didn't know were possible. James opened his briefcase again and pulled out a legal document that I recognized as a medical directive refusing blood transfusions. "Doctor, the family has already signed advance directives regarding blood transfusions. They are prepared to accept whatever outcome results from following their religious convictions." I stared at that document, remembering the day years ago when Margaret and I had signed it, full of faith and certainty that we were making the right choice. We had felt so righteous, so prepared to face any trial that might test our loyalty to Jehovah. Now, looking at that piece of paper that could seal my son's fate, I felt nothing but revulsion. How had I been so blind? How had I convinced myself that God would want me to choose a document over my son's life? I thought about all the times I had counseled other families in similar situations, how I had praised their faith when they chose to let their loved ones die rather than accept blood, I remembered feeling proud of our organization's unwavering stance, convinced that our willingness to die for our beliefs proved that we had the true religion. But standing in that hospital room, watching my son slip away while men in suits talked about organizational loyalty, I finally saw the madness of it all. My dear friends who might be listening to this story, I want you to understand something that took me decades to realize. There's a difference between faith and fanaticism, between devotion to God and blind obedience to men who claim to speak for Him. As I stood in that hospital room, surrounded by elders who cared more about organizational reputation than my son's life, I began to understand that distinction for the first time. The weight of 23 years of indoctrination was crushing down on me, but underneath that weight, a small voice was growing stronger, whispering that maybe, just maybe, love was supposed to triumph over law, mercy over judgment, life over doctrine. If you're watching this and finding pieces of your own story in mine, if you've ever felt that cold fear when questioning what you've been taught, please know that you're not alone in this journey. Sometimes the most faithful thing we can do is ask the questions that others are afraid to voice. Please leave a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I read every single one, and your support gives me strength to continue sharing these difficult truths. Your stories matter to me, and together we can help others find the courage to think for themselves. Dr. Mitchell's pager buzzed urgently, and she glanced at it with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to life and death situations. I have to check on David right now, but I'll be back in 5 minutes. For your final answer, please understand that after that point, it may be too late to help him. She hurried out of the room, leaving the four of us alone with the weight of an impossible decision hanging between us like a sword suspended by the thinnest of threads. Timothy immediately moved to assert control over the situation, his years of experience in handling organizational crises kicking into high gear. Robert, Margaret, I know this is difficult, but we need to remember that our loyalty to Jehovah is being tested right now. Satan often uses our deepest emotions and strongest family bonds to try to turn us away from God's requirements. The way he spoke about Satan using my love for my son to lead me astray struck me as profoundly twisted. But I had heard similar reasoning countless times over the years during judicial committee meetings and circuit assembly talks. It was standard organizational logic. Any emotion or instinct that conflicted with Watchtower doctrine was automatically classified as satanic influence that needed to be resisted. I had used similar arguments myself when counseling families, facing difficult decisions, always confident that I was helping them stay on the narrow path to salvation. Now, hearing those familiar words used to justify letting my son die, I began to see how cruel and manipulative that reasoning really was. James pulled out his phone and began scrolling through his contacts. I'm going to call the hospital liaison committee in the city. They have more experience with complex cases like this, and they might know of treatment options that the local doctors haven't considered. His fingers moved quickly across the screen, and within moments, he was speaking. In hushed tones to someone on the other end of the line, I caught fragments of his conversation. Massive blood loss, family under pressure, need immediate support. The clinical way he discussed my son's crisis, as if David were simply another case file rather than a young man fighting for his life, made my stomach turn with revulsion. Margaret had been standing quietly beside me, but I could feel the tension radiating from her body like heat from a furnace. Suddenly she stepped forward and faced Timothy directly, her voice steady but filled with an emotion I had never heard from her before. Timothy, I have a question for you, and I want you to answer me honestly. If this were your grandson lying in that hospital bed, if little Nathan were the one dying, would you really be able to stand here and talk about organizational loyalty? Would you really be able to watch him slip away because of a rule that might not even mean what we think it means? Her words carried a challenge that went beyond mere doctrinal disagreement. She was questioning the very foundations of everything we had been taught about putting God's organization above all earthly concerns, including family. Timothy's face flushed red, and I could see him struggling to maintain his composure in the face of Margaret's direct challenge. Nathan was his 4-year-old grandson, the light of his life, and invoking the boy's name in this context was clearly hitting him where it hurt most. Sister Henderson, that's an inappropriate question that puts me in an impossible position. We cannot make decisions based on hypothetical emotional scenarios. We must base our choices on biblical principles and organizational guidance, regardless of how difficult that might be. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, betraying an emotional vulnerability that he was desperately trying to hide behind his official elder persona. But Margaret wasn't finished. Years of suppressed doubts and questions seemed to be pouring out of her all at once, like water breaking through a damaged dam. Timothy, when did questioning become inappropriate? When did asking honest questions about life and death become something we're not allowed to do? I remember when I first studied with Sister Johnson 25 years ago, she encouraged me to ask questions, to research, to make sure I understood what I was believing. Now you're telling me that asking questions about watching my son die is inappropriate. Her voice was growing stronger with each word, and I could see Timothy and James exchanging concerned glances as they recognized that this situation was spiraling beyond their ability to control. James finished his phone call and approached us with a folder of documents that he had apparently been carrying in his briefcase. I've spoken with the hospital liaison committee, and they're sending Brother Martinez over immediately. He's handled over 50 blood refusal cases and has never had a family compromise their faith. He'll be here within the hour to help you navigate this situation properly. The way he emphasized the word properly made it clear that our current handling of the crisis was not meeting organizational standards. I realized that from their perspective, Margaret and I were failing a crucial test of faith, and they were bringing in reinforcements to ensure that we made the correct decision. Something inside me snapped at the mention of Brother Martinez and his track record of successful blood refusals. I thought about those 50 families he had helped, about the sons and daughters and mothers and fathers who had died while he guided their families through the process of refusing life-saving treatment. I imagined him standing in hospital rooms like this one, armed with legal documents and scriptural quotations, convincing grieving relatives that watching their loved ones die was somehow an act of worship. The image filled me with a rage so intense that I had to grip the back of a chair to steady myself. "Get out," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. Timothy looked confused, as if he hadn't heard me correctly. "I'm sorry, what did you say, Robert?" I raised my voice and looked directly into his eyes, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in 23 years. I said, "Get out, both of you. Get out of this room, get out of this hospital, and leave my family alone." The silence that followed my words was deafening. In all my years as an elder, I had never spoken to another elder with such disrespect, and certainly never in front of my wife. The organizational chain of command was sacred, and what I had just done amounted to open rebellion against the authority structure that governed every aspect of our lives. Timothy's shock quickly gave way to anger, and his voice took on the cold, authoritative tone that I had heard him use when delivering judicial committee decisions. "Brother Henderson, you are clearly under tremendous stress, and Satan is using that stress to cloud your judgment. You're not thinking clearly right now, and you're going to regret these words when this crisis has passed. I strongly recommend that you take a few minutes to pray and reconsider your attitude before you say something that you'll have to account for later." The implied threat in his words was unmistakable. He was giving me one last chance to fall back in line before he began the process that would lead to my removal as an elder and possibly my disfellowshipping from the congregation. But for the first time in my adult life, I didn't care about organizational consequences. I didn't care about my position as an elder, my standing in the congregation, or my reputation within the circuit. All I cared about was my son, lying in a hospital bed a few rooms away, dying while these men played theological games with his life. Timothy, I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years. You're more concerned about protecting the organization's reputation than you are about saving my son's life. You're more worried about Brother Martinez's track record than you are about David's survival. That tells me everything I need to know about what this organization really values. Margaret moved closer to me and took my hand, her gesture clearly showing that she supported my decision to confront the elders. "Robert's right," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "We've spent 25 years trusting this organization to guide our decisions, and look where it's brought us. We're standing in a hospital room talking about letting our son die to maintain our reputation with a group of men in New York who don't even know David exists. How is that different from any other cult that demands human sacrifice to prove loyalty?" Her use of the word cult was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Both Timothy and James recoiled as if she had physically struck them. James closed his briefcase with a sharp snap and stood up, his face flushed with indignation. "Sister Henderson, that kind of language is completely unacceptable. You're obviously allowing emotional stress to override your spiritual judgment. When this crisis is over, we're going to need to have a serious discussion about your attitude toward God's organization." He turned to Timothy and nodded toward the door. "I think we should give them some time to reconsider their position. Perhaps when Brother Martinez arrives, they'll be more receptive to proper spiritual guidance." As they prepared to leave, Timothy made one final attempt to reassert his authority over the situation. "Robert, Margaret, I want you to know that we love you and we're praying for you during this difficult time. But I also want you to understand that the decisions you make in the next few hours will have consequences that extend far beyond this hospital room. Your standing in the congregation, your relationship with Jehovah, your eternal salvation, all of these things are at stake right now. Don't let temporary emotion cause you to make permanent mistakes that you'll regret for eternity." With those words hanging in the air like a curse, both elders walked out of the consultation room, leaving Margaret and me alone for the first time since this nightmare had begun. The silence that followed their departure was both terrifying and liberating. For the first time in decades, Margaret and I were free to make a decision without organizational oversight, without committee input, without having to consider how our choice would reflect on the congregation's reputation. We stood there holding hands in that sterile little room, two people who had spent their entire adult lives following other people's rules, suddenly faced with the most important decision they would ever make. I looked into my wife's eyes and saw my own fears and hopes reflected back at me, but I also saw something else. A determination that went beyond organizational loyalty, beyond doctrinal compliance, beyond everything we had been taught about. Submission to religious authority. "Margaret," I said softly, "if we choose to save David's life, there's no going back. They'll disfellowship us, and we'll lose everything. Our friends, our community, probably most of our family. Are you prepared for that?" She squeezed my hand tighter and looked at me with an intensity that took my breath away. "Robert, if we let David die to keep our standing in the organization, we'll lose everything that actually matters. We'll lose our son, we'll lose our souls, and we'll lose each other. I'd rather spend the rest of my life disfellowshipped and alive than spend eternity knowing that I chose a religion over my child." Dr. Mitchell reappeared in the doorway just as Margaret finished speaking, her face showing the strain of a physician who had spent too many years watching families struggle with impossible decisions. Behind her stood a nurse carrying a clipboard with consent forms that would determine my son's fate. "Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, I'm sorry, but I can't wait any longer. David's vital signs are becoming increasingly unstable, and his organs are beginning to fail from lack of oxygen. If we don't proceed with the transfusion immediately, we will lose him within the next 20 to 30 minutes. I need your signature on this consent form right now, or I need you to officially refuse treatment so that we can focus on making him comfortable in his final moments." The stark brutality of her words hit me like a physical blow. This was it, the moment when all the theological discussions and organizational protocols would give way to the simple reality of signing a piece of paper that would either save my son's life or condemn him to death. My hand trembled as I reached for the pen she was offering, 23 years of indoctrination warring against every paternal instinct I possessed. I thought about the countless times I had stood at the podium, explaining to the congregation why faithful Christians must be willing to die rather than compromise their beliefs. I had told stories of young people who had chosen death over blood transfusions, holding them up as examples of courage and faith that we should all aspire to emulate. But now, faced with the reality of applying that doctrine to my own son, those stories felt like tales from a nightmare rather than inspiring examples of faithfulness. I remembered 16-year-old Sarah Williams from the neighboring congregation, who had died from leukemia rather than accept the blood transfusions that could have saved her life. I had attended her funeral and listened to the circuit overseer praise her parents for their unwavering loyalty to Jehovah's requirements. At the time, I had felt moved by their dedication and proud to be part of an organization that produced such spiritual giants. Now I wondered how Sarah's parents felt in the dark hours of the night when they were alone with their grief and their memories of their daughter's final days. Margaret stepped closer to me and whispered urgently in my ear, "Robert, look at me. Not at the elders, not at the organization, not at what anyone else might think. Look at me and remember who we were before we became Jehovah's Witnesses. Remember how we felt when David was born, when we held him for the first time and promised to protect him from everything that could hurt him. Remember the man you were before you became an elder, before you started caring more about organizational approval than about your own family." Her words cut through the fog of confusion and fear that had been clouding my judgment, bringing me back to a fundamental truth I had lost somewhere along the way. I thought about that day, 26 years ago when David was born, how I had held his tiny body in my arms and marveled at the miracle of his existence. I remembered the fierce, protective love that had overwhelmed me in that moment, the absolute certainty that I would do anything to keep him safe and help him thrive. That love hadn't been conditional on his religious beliefs or his loyalty to any organization. It had been pure and unconditional, the kind of love that I had always believed God himself felt for his children. How had I allowed an organization to convince me that God would want me to choose doctrine over that kind of love? Dr. Mitchell checked her watch and gave me a look that mixed professional urgency with human compassion. "Mr. Henderson, I know this is the most difficult decision you'll ever have to make, but David's time is running out. His blood pressure has dropped to dangerous levels, and his brain and other vital organs are not getting the oxygen they need to function. Every minute we delay increases the risk that even if we do save his life, he may suffer permanent brain damage or other complications. Please, I'm begging you as both a doctor and a mother, let us help your son." The desperation in her voice broke through the last of my resistance. This woman, who didn't know me or my family, who had no personal stake in our religious beliefs or organizational standing, cared more about saving David's life than the elders who had claimed to be our spiritual brothers for over 2 decades. She was willing to fight for my son when the men who were supposed to be shepherding our souls were more concerned about maintaining doctrinal purity than preserving human life. In that moment, I saw clearly the difference between genuine love and organizational loyalty, between divine compassion and human rules masquerading as God's will. I took the pen from Dr. Mitchell's hand, and as I did, I felt something inside me break apart and fall away like chains that had been binding me for decades. Doctor, please do everything you can to save my son's life. Use blood, use whatever treatments you think will help. Spare no expense and take no shortcuts. David's life is worth more than any doctrine, any rule, any religious teaching that would demand his death. My signature on that consent form was more than just medical authorization. It was a declaration of independence from 23 years of spiritual bondage, a choice to put love above law and mercy above judgment. Margaret burst into tears of relief and threw her arms around me, holding me tight as we both realized the magnitude of what we had just done. We had chosen our son over our religion, our family over our faith community, our hearts over our heads. The decision felt both terrifying and liberating, like jumping off a cliff while simultaneously growing wings. Dr. Mitchell smiled for the first time since we had met her and hurried out of the room to begin the process that we prayed would save David's life. As she disappeared down the corridor, Margaret and I stood there holding each other and wondering what kind of life awaited us on the other side of this choice. The peace that had settled over me after signing the consent form was shattered moments. Later, when Brother Martinez arrived at the hospital, accompanied by Timothy and James. Martinez was a man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and the kind of quiet authority that came from years of handling crisis situations for the organization. He had driven over from the city immediately after receiving James's call, bringing with him a briefcase full of legal documents and medical alternatives that had been prepared specifically for situations like ours. His reputation for helping families maintain their faith during blood transfusion crises was legendary throughout our circuit, and I knew that his arrival meant the organizational pressure was about to intensify dramatically. "Brother Henderson," Martinez said as he entered the consultation room, his voice carrying the calm confidence of a man who had never failed to convince a family to refuse blood transfusions. "I understand that you're facing a very difficult situation with David. I want you to know that I've handled many cases similar to yours, and I've seen Jehovah provide miraculous healing when families demonstrate faith by refusing blood. The doctors may say that transfusion is the only option, but we know that God can work through alternative treatments that don't violate his requirements." His words were delivered with the practiced smoothness of a sales pitch, and I could hear the underlying assumption that I would naturally want to reverse my decision and choose organizational loyalty over my son's life. Looked at this man who had traveled over 100 miles to convince me to let my son die, and I felt a surge of anger unlike anything I had ever experienced. "Brother Martinez, I appreciate you coming here, but I've already made my decision. I've authorized the doctors to give David whatever treatment they think will save his life, including blood transfusions. My son is more important to me than maintaining my standing in the organization." The shock on his face was almost comical. Clearly, this was not a response he was accustomed to receiving from distraught Jehovah's Witness parents facing blood transfusion decisions. Martinez opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder filled with medical research papers and legal documents. "Brother Henderson, I think you're making this decision under tremendous emotional stress, and you may not be considering all the alternatives. Let me show you some information about bloodless surgical techniques that have been successful in cases similar to David's. Many hospitals have had excellent results using blood substitutes and other treatments that don't violate biblical requirements. He spread the papers across the small table in the consultation room, creating an impressive display of official-looking documents that were clearly designed to overwhelm families with scientific terminology and medical jargon. But I was no longer the compliant elder who would automatically defer to organizational expertise on medical matters. Brother Martinez, have you spoken with Dr. Mitchell about David's specific condition? Have you reviewed his medical records and consulted with the surgical team that treated him? Or are you simply here to pressure us into refusing treatment based on generic information that may not apply to our son's situation? My questions caught him off guard, and I could see him struggling to maintain his composure in the face of direct challenges to his authority and expertise. Timothy stepped forward, clearly agitated by my continued resistance to organizational guidance. Robert, Brother Martinez has driven over 100 miles to help your family during this crisis. The least you could do is listen respectfully to what he has to say, instead of attacking him for trying to help you maintain your faith. His voice carried a note of desperation that I had never heard from him before. Clearly, my defiance was creating a situation that none of them had anticipated or knew how to handle effectively. Margaret, who had been standing quietly beside me, suddenly spoke up with a clarity and strength that surprised everyone in the room. Gentlemen, my husband and I have made our decision, and nothing you say is going to change our minds. We are going to save our son's life, and we don't need your permission or your approval to do that. If that means we lose our standing in the organization, if that means we get disfellowshipped, if that means we lose friends and family members who choose the organization over us, then so be it. Some things are more important than religious. Politics and our son's life is one of those things. The three elders stared at Margaret as if she had suddenly grown a second head. In all their years of handling crisis situations, they had apparently never encountered a sister who would speak so directly and forcefully about choosing family over organizational loyalty. Martinez closed his briefcase with a sharp snap and stood up, his professional demeanor slipping slightly to reveal the frustration underneath. Brother and Sister Henderson, I'm very sorry to see that you're allowing Satan to use this tragedy to turn you away from Jehovah. When David recovers, if he recovers, you're going to have to live with the knowledge that you compromised your faith and damaged your relationship with God to save his temporary physical life. I pray that someday you'll realize the mistake you're making and return to the truth before it's too late. His words were clearly intended as a final warning, a last chance for us to reconsider our decision before facing the consequences of our rebellion against organizational authority. But instead of intimidating us, his threat only strengthened our resolve. As he and the other elders prepared to leave, I felt a sense of liberation that I hadn't experienced since my early days as a young father, before organizational responsibilities and doctrinal compliance had consumed my life. For the first time in decades, Margaret and I were free to make a decision based on love rather than fear, on conscience rather than conformity, on what we knew to be right rather than what we had been told was required. The hours that followed, our confrontation with the elders passed in a blur of medical activity and emotional turbulence that I will never forget as long as I live. Dr. Mitchell and her team worked with the kind of focused intensity that only comes from years of training and genuine dedication to saving lives. They had rushed David into surgery immediately after receiving our consent, and now Margaret and I found ourselves in the waiting room, surrounded by the familiar sounds of hospital life, but feeling completely disconnected from the world we had known for over 2 decades. The antiseptic smell of the corridors, the soft beeping of medical equipment from nearby rooms, and the hushed conversations of other families dealing with their own crises created a strange backdrop for what felt like the most important night of our lives. Margaret sat beside me, holding my hand with a grip that spoke of shared determination and mutual support. But I could see the fear in her eyes that mirrored my own terror about what we had just done. We had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, made a choice that would define the rest of our lives and potentially cost us everything we had built within the organization over the past 25 years. The weight of that decision pressed down on us like a physical burden, but underneath the fear was something else, a sense of rightness, of alignment with our deepest values that I hadn't felt in years of organizational compliance and doctrinal conformity. Around midnight, Dr. Mitchell emerged from the surgical suite, still wearing her scrubs, but with a smile on her face that told us everything we needed to know before she even spoke. "Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, I'm happy to tell you that David is going to be fine. The surgery was successful, and the blood transfusion has stabilized his condition completely. His vital signs are strong, and we expect him to make a full recovery. Over the next few weeks, you made the right choice. Without that transfusion, we would have lost him tonight." Her words washed over us like a wave of relief so intense that I felt my knees buckle, and Margaret began crying tears of joy and gratitude that seemed to come from the deepest part of her soul. We were allowed to see David briefly in the recovery room, where he lay connected to various monitors but breathing steadily and showing the healthy color that had been absent from his face just hours earlier. As I looked down at my son, alive and healing because we had chosen medical science over religious doctrine, I felt a complex mixture of emotions that I struggled to process fully. There was overwhelming relief and gratitude for his survival, but also a growing anger at the organization that had tried to convince us to let him die, and a deep sadness for all the families who had been less fortunate, who had followed organizational guidance and watched their loved ones slip away unnecessarily. The next few days brought a steady stream of visitors to our home, but they were not the supportive friends and congregation members we might have expected during a family crisis. Instead, we received a parade of elders, circuit overseers, and other organizational representatives who came with judicial committee summons, disfellowshipping letters, and stern warnings about the consequences of our rebellious choices. Timothy and James returned with the presiding overseer from the neighboring congregation, armed with notebooks and recording devices, ready to conduct formal proceedings that would determine our fate within the organization we had served faithfully for over 2 decades. The Judicial Committee meeting took place in the back room of our local Kingdom Hall, the same room where I had participated in dozens of similar proceedings over the years, always confident that I was helping to maintain the spiritual purity of God's organization. Now I found myself sitting on the other side of the table, facing 3 men who had been my close friends and spiritual brothers just days earlier, but who now looked at me with the cold professionalism of judges preparing to render a verdict they had already decided. The irony of the situation was not lost on me. I was being tried for the crime of saving my son's life by men who claimed to represent a God of love and mercy. Brother Stevens, the committee chairman, opened the proceedings with a prayer that asked for divine guidance in handling this serious matter of apostasy and rebellion against God's clear requirements. His words dripped with the kind of righteous indignation that I had heard used against countless other members who had dared to question organizational authority. And I realized that I was now experiencing firsthand the spiritual brutality that I had helped to inflict on others during my years as an elder. The questions that followed were designed not to understand our reasoning or explore the complexities of our situation, but to establish a clear record of our defiance that could be used to justify our removal from the congregation. Margaret and I tried to explain our thought process, our research into the biblical basis for the blood doctrine, our conclusion that saving David's life was more important than maintaining organizational approval. but our words fell on deaf ears that had been trained to hear only compliance or rebellion, faithfulness or apostasy. Brother Stevens interrupted our explanations repeatedly, dismissing our concerns as emotional weakness and independent thinking that had led us away from the truth. "Brother Henderson," he said with the kind of patronizing tone I had once used, "myself, you've allowed the pressures of this situation to cloud your spiritual judgment. The faithful and discreet slave has provided clear guidance on this matter, and your decision to ignore that guidance demonstrates a lack of faith that is incompatible with continued membership in God's organization." The proceedings lasted nearly 3 hours, but the outcome had been predetermined from the moment we signed that consent form in the hospital. Margaret and I were formally disfellowshipped for apostasy and rebellion against theocratic order, our names announced to the congregation. The following week, as individuals who were no longer to be associated with by faithful Jehovah's Witnesses. The announcement was brief and clinical. Robert and Margaret Henderson are no longer Jehovah's Witnesses. But those words carried the weight of social death within our community, the severing of relationships that had sustained us for over 2 decades. The weeks that followed our disfellowshipping were among the most difficult of our lives, but also among the most enlightening. Friends who had been like family to us for years crossed the street to avoid speaking to us. Relatives stopped calling and visiting, and our entire social support system evaporated overnight, as if we had never existed. The shunning was complete and merciless, designed to break our spirits and force us to return to the organization in repentance, begging for reinstatement and expressing appropriate remorse for our rebellious choices. But instead of breaking us, the experience opened our eyes to the true nature of the relationships we had thought were based on genuine love and Christian fellowship. David recovered fully from his injuries, returning to work within a month and showing no lasting effects from either the accident or the medical treatment that had saved his life. His gratitude for our decision was overwhelming and humbling, especially when he told us that he had been having his own doubts about the organization for years, but had been afraid to voice them because of our positions as elders and pioneers. Our crisis had given him the courage to begin his own journey of questioning and eventual departure from the witnesses, and together our family began the difficult but liberating process of rebuilding our lives outside the organizational structure that had controlled every aspect of our existence for so long. The research that Margaret and I began conducting into the history and practices of Jehovah's Witnesses was both shocking and validating, confirming many of the doubts we had been suppressing for years and revealing patterns of control, manipulation, and doctrinal inconsistency that we had been trained not to notice or question. We learned about the organization's history of false prophecies, their policy of protecting child abusers, their financial practices that enriched the leadership while demanding sacrifices from members, and their systematic destruction of families through shunning policies that had no basis in biblical love or Christian mercy. Today, 5 years after that terrible night in the hospital, I can say with complete certainty that choosing to save David's life was the best decision Margaret and I ever made, not just because it preserved our son's physical existence, but because it freed our entire family from a religious system that valued organizational loyalty above human life and divine law above divine love. We lost many things when we left the witnesses: our social circle, our extended family relationships, our sense of belonging to a special chosen people. But we gained something far more valuable: the freedom to think for ourselves, to follow our consciences, to love unconditionally, and to worship God without the mediation of human organizations that claim exclusive authority to interpret His will. For those of you who may be watching this video while struggling with your own doubts about the Watchtower organization, I want you to know that the fear you feel about questioning their teachings is not divinely inspired. It is the result of carefully constructed psychological conditioning designed to prevent you from thinking independently about matters that affect your eternal welfare. The organization teaches that questioning their authority is equivalent to questioning God Himself. But this is a false equation that serves only to protect their power and influence over your life. God gave you a mind and a conscience for a reason, and using those gifts to evaluate religious claims is not apostasy, it is spiritual maturity. The blood doctrine that nearly cost us our son's life is just one example of how the Watchtower organization places its interpretation of Scripture above the value of human life, but it is far from the only harmful teaching that causes unnecessary suffering for faithful members. Their policies on education, careers, family relationships, medical treatment, and social interaction all serve to isolate members from outside influences and create a closed system of information control that makes questioning extremely difficult and leaving almost impossible. But escape is possible, and life beyond the organization is not only survivable, but often far more fulfilling than the restricted existence they promote as the only path to divine approval. If my story has touched your heart or helped you in any way, please take a moment to let me know in the comments below. Your support means everything to me, and knowing that our painful experience can help others find the courage to think for themselves makes all the suffering worthwhile. Whether you're still inside the organization but beginning to have doubts, already out but struggling with the aftermath, or simply trying to understand what your friends or family members are going through, you are not alone in this journey. There is a whole community of former witnesses who understand exactly what you're experiencing, and we're here to support each other through the difficult process of rebuilding our lives based on love rather than fear, truth rather than doctrine, and conscience rather than organizational compliance. Please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and share your own story in the comments. Every voice that speaks out helps others find the strength to break free from systems that value control over compassion and authority over authentic spirituality.